Now we finally get down to our first real step in entering the game world that you've been creating. Of course, I'm referring to the player characters, as I'm sure you've already figured out if you looked at the title to this video. Creating and developing the characters that your players will be using in your campaign is one of the most important parts of any game, and that cannot be overstressed. This is because those player characters are the protagonists of the whole story. More than that, they're the only means by which your players can interact with the world that you're creating for them, doing their part in building the continuing series of stories that will eventually make up the far greater story of the campaign. One of the most interesting parts about player characters is that they should be only partially within the ability of the game masters to influence during their creation. Actually, you probably will be surrendering most of your control over the game to the players of each given character. This is a good thing, and one that you should encourage, since it's one of the elements of gaming that constantly brings fresh life to the storytelling of role-playing games. That deliberate yielding of control to your players means that you're going to be continually surprised by what comes next, almost as much as the players themselves. You present obstacles, and they figure out ways to overcome them, and you both build upon this shared synergy. Try not to interfere with this aspect of role-playing games more than is absolutely necessary, because of the reasons made apparent through this quote from Paul Olsegi, and I do apologize for mangling his name, as I'm sure I have. When one person is the author of both the character's adversity and its resolution, play isn't fun. That quote has multiple layers of meaning, which is my reason for sharing it, to let you mull it over and consider how it will influence your telling of stories through the medium of role-playing games. You need your players, and your players need their characters. The more freedom you can give them in that creation process, and the more freedom to make use of their characters as implements of overcoming the various obstacles you'll place before them, the better. However, there are some parts of character creation that you need to consider and on which you should advise and counsel with your players, all the better to ensure that the characters your players make will mesh well with the rest of their party of fellow player characters, and that they'll mesh equally well into the overarching story that you'll all be telling together. That leads us to two primary considerations: what limitations will be placed on the characters that are allowed, and what limitations will be placed on the changes made to and development of those characters over the course of play. As I said before, your goal in providing limitations on what sort of characters your players can make isn't to restrict their fun. It's to help them narrow down the nearly infinite possibilities presented by the process of storytelling, and then create a character that will fit into the game world at large and the gaming part of player characters in specifics. All of this stuff should come up as a part of what many role-playing gamers will call Session 0, the session where you discuss with your players, either individually or as a group or both, or first one and then the other, what you expect from the campaign at large and from them as players, before brainstorming some ideas about the game world and how their characters fit into it. So here are some of the considerations that should come up as part of the character building part of one of these Session Zeros. First off, what game are we playing? This is all the basic stuff that every character needs to know in order to even begin the process of brainstorming. What's the genre? What's the game system? What's the game world? What are the basics of the plot for the campaign? You know, the stuff anybody would have to know right from the start if they're going to have any hope of being able to interact with the campaign at all. For a plot, it's what you'd see on the dust jacket on the back of a book, or the trailer for a movie. Second up, how heroic are the players expected to be, or the player characters, rather? This is intended to be a sliding scale sort of thing, so the players have a range of realistic actions and character choices that they can make. All the same, even if everybody in the campaign is a murder hobo, are they still the good guys, whatever that means? They should be, most likely. Or are they morally ambiguous? Or are they more morally ambiguous than that? For example, in a supers campaign setting, there's a pretty big difference between telling your players that everybody will be part of the League of Heroic Good-Doers and having everybody play the part of newly joined members of your version of Heroes for Hire. They both might do the right things, eventually, but their motives and methods are going to be a whole lot different. So making sure your players know the general expectations of how much grayness or edgy behavior is allowed before the game won't be fun for you anymore, or might start to alienate the other players, is really important right from the start. On this subject, though, I do feel that I should share a quote from Gary Gygax, which, frankly, I agree with. In my experience, most PCs go back and forth between the lines of flawed hero who breaks the rules, full-fledged anti-hero, and complete psycho. Anyone who plays virtuous hero always retires the character quickly, because it doesn't really work that well. What Gygax has pointed out with this quote is just something that you need to expect as a part of the game, and so something that you should roll with as part of handling your players as characters. Don't be judgmental or prudish about it. Use this truth to your advantage in crafting the story you'll be telling together with your players. What party roles are needed? In every party of player characters, there are a number of expected roles which need to be filled, speaking from a purely game mechanical standpoint. In games such as Dungeons & Dragons and its many derivatives such as Pathfinder and who knows what else, these party roles are fairly explicitly a part of the game's design. You have classes that fill the roles of the tank or meat shield, the stealth and dirty tricks expert, the blaster and environment manipulation master, and the healer and buffer. There are plenty of hybrid classes and alternate ways of accomplishing all of these various essential requirements in a given game, but those are the standard four. Of course, the exact needs of a party can vary quite a bit by genre and game system, though ultimately, again, these four elements show up everywhere. Other party roles that might be considered for inclusion, though, some of which have game mechanics that go with them, are the party face, or the one who handles people and has the contacts, the survivalist and tracker, who can keep the party alive in various environments, the lore master, who knows the stuff the party needs when they need it, and the Pokemon master, who always has some friends around. Yeah, that last one is a little bit glib, but it's a real archetype, considering how many character types out there rely on their friends, minions, pets, or summoned critters to equalize their battlefields. There's plenty more, naturally, but those are just the most basic ones. So think them over, and let your players know what roles have yet to be filled. There's more than enough permutations on each party role that there should be plenty of room for a near infinite number of variations on each of those party roles. 4. What character roles are needed? This is character roles, by the way, not party roles. In most fiction, there are group dynamics that take place. Some of these work, and others are strictly dysfunctional, while still others are completely dysfunctional and yet still somehow work. Some of these group dynamics work so well, in fact, that they get reused to heck and gone, like the five-man band, or Holmes and Watson, or the two protagonists of any buddy cop movie you might care to name, ranging from Lethal Weapon to K-9 to Zootopia. While individual players might or might not be able to fill these roles, letting them know that these social roles actually exist and can be filled will at least give them the option of trying. And who knows? Once you give somebody a chance, they might actually do a pretty good job. In my personal experience, though, typically it's best to let the party itself figure out who's going to fill the roles of team leader, second-in-command, devil's advocate, intellectual, party heart, reliable stabilizer, lovable rogue, plucky comedy relief, and so forth. In fact, maybe you shouldn't even bring it up in the first place. Just let them watch this video to get the ideas started in their collective heads, and then figure it out on their own. All of the considerations that I just presented are there so that your players can start to pare down their options a bit, limiting their character creation process to something a bit more manageable. Then, once you've laid out all of this to figure out what a player character isn't, then is the time to let your player go home and sleep on the matter so that they can start doing some of their own thought into what their character is. Certainly, if your players immediately realize just what they want to play right there at the table in session 0, that's fantastic, and you can walk them through the whole process right then and there. But characters are serious business, and they require time and effort. Some game systems will just require a bunch of statistics and don't really take character into consideration. I'm looking at you, Dungeons & Dragons. Well, for games like this, do that part as soon as possible, so the player will have a character sheet all filled out and ready to go. Then they can start to muse over the sheet and start thinking about the details of their actual character, their background, their personality. Hopefully they'll also find the character questionnaire that I provided as a link below to be of use during this process and start thinking it over as well. Because there's so much to cover, the next video is where I'll be discussing character development in more detail, as well as the character questionnaire, which I've linked below, and will link again at the bottom of that next video just to make sure you get it. But before I end this video, I'd like to discuss another important part of player-character interactions with the game world: how you convey information to your players. There are two parts to presenting information to your players: world knowledge and situational knowledge. World knowledge is what your players and their characters know about the world in a global, esoteric sense, its history, its cultures, and so forth. In other words, all the stuff that somebody actually living in that world would know as a part of their background, and that a player should know so that they can act in an informed fashion. Situational knowledge, meanwhile, is what your players' characters can observe in a given moment within the game world, the stuff that's right before them, which will almost certainly have a context within their global knowledge of the world, but also typically concerns their immediate survival. Probably the simplest, most straightforward way for you to fill in your characters and the world is to just write up a basic summary of the game, its world and its lore, intended for use by the players as a basic background for what they and their characters should know. I've provided a link to a blank template for such a document, as well as instructions for it below this video so you can have it now. But I'll be reviewing those instructions in a later video when I actually cover the process of world building. If you can make such a document about a page in length, perhaps 2, then you're doing a fantastic job. That's about as much attention span as you can expect from your average player. Don't misunderstand me, by the way. I am not calling your average player dumb. Quite the opposite. By implying that they'll actually be able to take time out of their busy schedules and read over a 1 to 2 page document on what they should know about your game world implies that they actually care about the game, about you, and about their fellow players. More than 2 pages, maximum, is straining anybody's brain far too much. And so if you go over that limit, you probably need to start the process of brutal hack work editing. Just save your early drafts under a separate file name, since the information might be useful later, and then go to town, which incidentally is a great way to do editing on most files. Save your first draft so you don't lose anything, and then start chopping. The other way to convey what your players' characters know about the world is to just mention it to them as you go along. When they get to a new area or meet some new people, just give them a couple minutes worth of background, the sort of stuff that everybody knows about that part of your game world. As they fill out the character questionnaire I've provided, a process that will surely take them quite a lot of time and effort, so try not to rush them more than absolutely necessary, start mentioning even more details when they enter places that they've indicated their characters should know about. Or tell them explicitly that they know something, when they know it, and you think it's important that they know it now. Don't be afraid to remind your players of stuff that their characters should know, and be even less afraid of letting them do over some actions they might take in the course of play when they discover some more details and want to take those actions back, based on the claim that their characters wouldn't have done that normally, but the player didn't know enough or forgot something important until after they'd already done something they consider game-breaking or out of character. If it really means so much to them, and you can backpedal without disrupting too much of the game's flow of action, hey, go ahead. Of course, at the same time, you should try to avoid spoilers. Give too much, and you can ruin the player's sense of fun in uncovering mysteries. There is a pretty careful balancing act here, and ranging between giving your players enough world information to act in an informed fashion, and giving them so much that they either zone out due to information saturation, or start to be disappointed at being given too much too easily. You know your players, or will get to know them, and this is one of the many aspects of running the game that you'll have to determine on your own, based on what you know that I simply can't. As a final note on the subject of world knowledge, though, I'll be discussing the idea of keeping an ongoing game history in much more detail in a future video. I'd like to broach the idea now, start keeping track of what your players and their characters know, and keep an ongoing, living document of that information, which you update after every game session. This will make keeping your players immersed in the game world ever so much easier. When describing the setting of a given location to your players, probably the best, simplest way to do so is to make a note to appeal to at least two senses. Write it down if you have to. At first, you'll probably have to make, as I said, literal notes to yourself to remember this. Write it down again. Once you've had enough practice, though, this should start to become second nature. The first sense should pretty much always be sight, unless there are some really good reasons not to include that sense's input. The second will usually be hearing, but there's plenty of room for playing around with sensory input, so don't feel bound by the two-sense rule. Use as many as seems appropriate, and for which you have time without losing your players' attention. Here's a list of the sort of sensory information that will help your players to properly interact with the world their characters encounter. Sight. You should include the physical dimensions of a room, the major objects of interest, furniture, the style of decoration. You might use real-world civilizations as examples to help describe the look and feel of some places. Murals, paintings, mosaics, and other stuff on the walls and floors and ceiling. Tapestries, wall hangings, carpets and banners, and occupants, especially occupants. They should get their own separate set of descriptions right after you set up the place. For hearing, consider, does the room echo? Is sound muffled? Does the party hear anybody talking, walking, breathing? What special qualities do these sounds have, such as the tone of someone's voice, or the sound of a peg leg on flagstones, or an asthmatic's wheeze? Taste and smell. These are often forgotten, but they are very important. Does the room have a notable scent, or is there a taste on the air? Is it a pleasant taste or smell? Unpleasant? Perhaps a mix? Perhaps it's a tentative smell, an oddly pleasant scent like old spices and long-dried herbs, that at first attracts the players until they discover that it's the smell of a hideous but well-preserved mummy hiding behind a tapestry. Or perhaps they smell something sweet right on the edge of being sickly, and which is lullingly soporific, making them feel very relaxed, and which they start to investigate, only to discover that it's a Venus flytrap sized for humans. Touch. What is the temperature? What about humidity? Is it comfortable or uncomfortable? Is there any wind? What's the weather like? If they're indoors, is it drafty? Suspiciously so? Such as, say, the breeze caused by a hidden passage? What does the player's characters' skins feel like in the room? Do they get goosebumps or clammy sweat? Then emotional impressions. How does the place make the player characters feel? Is it calming? Or is there an aura of menace? Can they sense instinctively if bad things took place here in times past, but not nearly past enough? Memories. Has one or more of the player characters been in this place before? Well, what happened? Is there something that happened before the game began, as part of character history, or is it something that happened during the course of the game, for which you're just dropping a reminder? Feel free to just toss in places that a character might have visited before whenever you think it would be fun, and not inappropriate. The more you know about a player's character, the more frequently you might do this, and the more specific you might get about what happened when they were in the location in question. Now, also remember, there are two potential audiences for this information, all of this sensory information: the players and their characters. If you just address the players directly, making metaphors that only a human from Earth would understand, then you'll have the advantage of getting your point across quickly and completely, with little chance for misunderstanding, and with minimal effort on your part to go hunting around for descriptive language. It's fast, it's easy, it works. The disadvantage of this approach, of course, is that there's a pretty serious danger of damaging or even outright destroying the immersion of your players. A lot of pulling back from a game isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be careful not to go too far, and so gauging your players' reactions to your various descriptions of this or any other sort is a critical skill you need to work on developing. On the other hand, you can go the completely immersive route and just describe places and events in ways that would be apparent to the player characters. Done right, and you can help your players to unlock their imaginations, making the game feel really real for them, at least for a little while. The sensory impressions I've described above are a great way to start doing this sort of thing. Just play around with them, see what tolerances for details your players have, and which senses get their attention the most. However, because your players are not, in fact, their characters, there is always a serious danger that you might actually lose your players somewhere along the line, either by giving too much of the wrong sort of information, perhaps mentioning how a room smells and its acoustics, but forgetting to inform your players about the key items with which they were supposed to interact to complete their present quest, or perhaps giving them too much information, so that it starts to saturate their imaginations to the breaking point. A little immersion breaking is probably a good thing overall, everything considered, and sometimes you should just focus on basic site-based layouts and nothing else, especially in stressful situations, such as when you've been playing for a really long time and everybody's starting to get tired. I hope that at least some of this video has given you some inspirations for how to enhance your gaming experiences and to assist your players in making their characters. If you liked what you saw and want to see more, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And with all of that said and all of that done, I wish you all the very best.